Hey guys, so we're back
We need to have a conversation. Your mom and dad need to have a conversation with you. It's about capital.
about capital, yes, and a particular element of capital, a big hulking, what does he call it? Cyclopean
Yeah, cyclopean. It's one
element.
of the big words he fucking trots out this chapter. We're talking about machinery and large scale industry.
Yes, and this is an interesting chapter, as we've probably said about every single chapter, but one of the fantastic things about this book is that it really goes through phases and will draw on completely different elements, types of research, etc. And this is where he gets brutal.
Yeah, he gets brutal. It's funny because we were contemplating skipping this chapter actually because it is long in the stats and the tables and
Mm-hmm.
such. But it's kind of like the origin of like Marxism really, where he right because the interesting thing about Capital as a book is normally in this show we're dealing with philosophy, we're dealing with sometimes theology, but Marx is writing an economic manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool thing about this chapter, I think more so than a lot of the other ones, is it is the total takedown of capitalism through the words of capitalists. You go through the book and all the footnotes are, you know, it's all these economists, but it's these
A
um
student of Ricardo shitting on some other
right, it's like
economist.
Children's Employment Commission fifth report. It's all these
Yeah.
government studies that were done, or reports done by the capitalists themselves to basically look through their budget and their tables. And he's basically using the capitalist apparatus to shit on capitalism. And I think it's fundamentally like, there's like a wink wink to it where he's like, and he's also kind of funny in this
Yes.
chapter. It's like it's I don't know. It's where Marx really finds his stride in this book. I think it's
Yeah.
only 500 pages in, but
And what's very interesting about that is, you start to recognize this movement, very like it's happened before, but this movement from the kind of like philosophical theoretical analysis that is steeped in theoreticians
hmm
and
hmm
philosophers, Kant and Hegel primarily, to this really hard, dense historical reading, almost like Noam Chomsky and his 10 million references to the historical register.
right.
Like here he is going into the documents and laying out what would be a strand of Marxian theory, like you would find in Gramsci, for instance, who went
Totally.
specifically to different factories and would poll and interview factory workers to get an understanding of what was going on with Italian labor,
Yeah, and
right?
this chapter is like, or these chapters that we're dealing with is also super influenced by Engels and his work dealing with the plight of the Manchester factory workers, and
Mm-hmm.
so it's like kind of super influenced by him. But it is this very cool thing. Like this is the period of Marx's life where he is exiled to London. Kind of hates it there. His family is so poor, so poor. Um, but he's just going to the library every day for, I can't remember the circumstances, but somebody gives him a pass, and he goes there for like 20 years. And this and two and three, this is what comes of it, and he is literally just going through the material. It's kind of like an academic's dream in some way. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, take 20 years, why don't you write a book? But it is very steeped in both anecdote from these different commissioned reports, um, but in the like nitty gritty of how factories work, why they function the way they do, what is the sort of philosophy behind organizing labor in the way that you do. from an economist's, from a capitalist perspective.
Absolutely.
And
He begins by making a very basic distinction that animates the rest of this section.
yes,
So as he's talking about the machine, he has to distinguish what is the difference between the tool and the machine, how the tool and the machine are continuous, right? And so he begins by defining, in some ways, the machine as a continuation of tools, right? Like you can have a knife that you use to chop things up, and
right.
you do so at a certain speed, and then at a very basic level, the machine, which is just a combination of levers and pulleys and gears and these basic elements, functions as a complication of that. But then there's a point at which the machine transcends the simple tool.
Right.
And this he describes as the body of the machine and the tool as an implement.
Yeah, and he talks about workers as opposed to controlling a tool, controlling a machine which operates many tools, right?
Yes, and those are the implements.
And so he kind of like, the progression that he gives us is from handicraft to manufacture, which is sort of the organization, the hierarchy of labor, to the final product, which is industry.
Yes.
And sort of demarcates the difference between this progression from kind of like a peasant or a guild type structure into the Industrial Revolution and what we would then consider as the like factory floor.
Yes. And we've described the way in which handicraft and this pre-industrial form of work, it was valorized, how it formed value for the peasant, for the serf, for the seller of goods. But in this case, there's a new relationship that the machine creates between the individual worker and their value, right? Because suddenly the machine becomes this accrual of capital. It not only costs money to be created, it not only requires people to create it, but it replaces the labor of multiple people. If one person working a loom produces, however many goods, it will produce 10 times that, 20
Right.
times that, 50 times that at a certain percentage of time that is quicker, right? And this formalizes the process of labor. But this doesn't happen all at once, and this is one of the things that Marx is emphasizing. That
Yeah, and it's kind of unique to the time that he's writing, actually, that this is, so he would be writing this in like the 1860s primarily. A lot of this is like just pre commune in Paris, but he's writing this at a time that's very unique to technology and to industry, where you are in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And this is, so there's a few words that like keep coming up in these chapters, and the cyclopean is one of them, actually, the way he describes these machines. But one of them is revolution. And
yes,
it's funny because we think of Marx as this revolutionary, which he was and is, but really where he talks about revolution the most is in the revolution that industry created for the world.
Yes, and technology in particular creates for industry.
And so as far as what he has to say about the development of machinery, I think the easiest thing is the beginning of chapter 15. He says the machine is a means for producing surplus value. And so he goes into the process of how this is created, right? Like, again, with Marx, there's a lot of things that, kind of seem like almost common sense to us because we live in the crazy mad future where our sort of exploitation is taken for granted almost. But he really lays out the process of removing the commons, of consolidating the sort of process of labor from a handicraft system where you are making something individually or with your family as sort of a more subsistence lifestyle, to then being collected into a group, which is sort of what we ended really our last episode about cooperation. But then this cooperation being usurped by the capitalist through the use of technology, that eventually, how could you say, equalizes the worker,
Yes.
where the, what at this time, the sort of patriarch would be considered the breadwinner, the person who should be paid most, to a system where the capitalist values child labor the most because they're the cheapest, but that really the goal of the capitalists in their production system is to make the task that they are providing their workers as simple as possible so anyone could do it, so it requires no specialization, and thus bringing wages to a minimum, but also, there not being a hierarchy of labor.
Yeah. Well, there's two fields of normalization. One that occurs directly out of technology, and one because of technology and how the valuation of individual labor is produced thereof. So, in the first case, you have the beginning of water systems of energy and early steam pulleys and
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
turbines and all of these inventions that lay the field for the development of large scale machines, which he calls the prime mover, like the central object, the machine that you can attach appendages to and can be operated by a human being to produce things quickly, right? And so in these cases, it's not entirely revolutionary yet. Yes, it will create a small factory. Yes, it will join people in cooperation, but it doesn't normalize an industry. And then you have these technological transformations, which he really links to the steam engine,
Mm-hmm.
and it's generalized power to be used in any industry to improve efficiency from the side of the capitalists, that this creates a normalization through labor.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you can ask the child and the woman to do jobs where before the strength of muscle was needed.
Right. You're really speaking to like this, the subservience of labor, right? Where, at one point you needed muscle or, a draft animal to power your tools or your machinery. But
Horsepower.
right, and there, he actually goes at length at describing how the reason why still to this day we describe cars by their horsepower, because he very clearly articulates that this was a common measurement that was usurped by the use of steam engines or through the use of river power.
Yeah, river power.
But theoretically, what he's actually alluding to is truly the subservience of the worker, and I would almost argue the full realization of the worker being someone selling their labor time for a wage, as opposed to being the driver of industry.
And while he doesn't say it explicitly, and this also refers to that moment about horsepower, the subservience of land, because as he points out, the actual horsepower, the practical horsepower, is determined by a fence being there, is determined by the quality of a road,
Mm-hmm.
right? But when a river is transformed by a canal and a bridge, and the land is flattened for train tracks, right? These units of measurement start to have this, continuity that makes them so that they can represent this real power, this real consistent power of the steam engine. And so you see in multiple different ways how, as this technology develops, the entire landscape of Europe and of the United States transforms in the face of these new industries.
Right. And you also have the consolidation. This is sort of the moment, and this is sort of another thing that where he's really influenced by Engels. But you have a mass migration from the countryside to the city, which is where the work is, because this is a moment where labor is being consolidated into what would be considered kind of the proto factory. We're not quite there yet, but where since time immemorial, you would center around these smaller rural existence where you're close to where the food is produced, but you're also making handicrafts like shoes or some other needed implement. But that is being, because of the capitalist model, you can't make a living doing that anymore. And so people are flooding to the cities for jobs. But at this point, there's still a hierarchy of labor where there's still specialization. But very quickly, what happens is both through, I think, natural humanity and plus the capitalist urge, is that machines become more and more refined. So, right, we all are sort of in this country, in America anyway, we're raised on this idea of the cotton gin, like, right? And Eli Whitney and his cotton gin. And it's not yet a factory, not yet an automation, but a tool that eliminates the need for as many workers, basically a tool that increases productivity. And in the hands of the capitalist, they see this for what it is, which is, if you can increase productivity, you then decrease the value of a commodity, which means you can sell more at a lower cost, which also means you can pay your workers less. And this all kind of feeds into the capitalist mindset of greed, of profit margins. But I think there's also a piece of human nature that's feeding into it too, where people have ingenuity. And it's like Pandora's box. Once you open the box and you start using machines to create anything, well, all of a sudden that simple machine that, I really have no idea what a cotton gin does, so I'm not going to use that as an example, but like, or I will, I guess, but whatever that machine that separates the cotton from the plant, or whatever the hell a cotton gin does, if anybody knows, chime in.
I don't.
Yeah, because why would we? But very quickly it's like, oh well, we can also make a machine that does that and then also takes the cotton, and I can't remember what the term is, but you take the cotton and you start making the like mass of cotton that turns into fabric, and there's always this constant movement forward of making the machine more efficient, more in our terms, more totalizing, more cool.
Yeah.
It has more spinny things, and it does more, it's like the Rube Goldberg concept, right? Like the more things it does, the more fascinated we are by it, right? Like,
and that's its revolutionary character, where in the past, say we're making a cotton shirt. There is someone over there who is picking the cotton, and there's someone over there who's processing it, and there's someone over there turning it into thread, and then someone else turning it into a shirt. But now, in the industrial age, all of these processes can be combined into one system, one complex system. And that complex system does not require the same specialization of skill to do any of these jobs, or the same strength and dexterity that is required to pick in the fields, right?
Or like skills earned over years,
exactly.
Learning a trade, right?
And instead, they can normalize the market, the labor market, and first, by installing the machine, release all of these people out into the labor market who now don't have jobs, right? Because their specific job has been replaced by a more systematic, more efficient machine that can be operated by a child, or
Right.
at this time by a woman who had different societal expectations. And
instead of running a loom, you are running a machine that runs 4 looms.
exactly.
So you're, instead of 4 people running a loom, there's one person running a machine that runs 4 looms. So you've got 3 people out of work.
Exactly. And so Marx sort of parallels the perspective of the worker who is getting subsistence from this work. A subsistence is taken away, the totality of subsistence. And when they are removed from the labor market, they are removed from purchasing.
Mm-hmm.
And then they return in a lessened position. They are now bringing their entire family. In times, he brings this up, some parents were essentially slave masters as they were sending their children.
That was the other word. I was like, what is the word he uses a lot in this chapter? Slave. And, Marx doesn't talk about slaves a great deal in this book because...
Unless literally talking about slaves.
Yeah, by this point in Europe, particularly, no one is, that type of practice would be considered abhorrent. Obviously, it was well in practice in America, and actually in this time in the 60s, in the 1860s. There was a thing going on here in America that kind of had a lot to do with slavery. You might have heard of it. It was called the Civil War.
And the industrial process.
But he does identify this trait that's very obvious in the capitalist mode of production, where it begins to treat its workers akin to how a plantation owner might keep their slaves, where they are completely subservient to you. And he mentions this. I think this is probably specifically kind of what you're referring to, but he basically makes this observation that with the introduction of machines, and we sort of spoke about this in the last episode too, where with the reduction of skill required for a job, or the reduction of what your obligation is, the skill, the craft required, the techne, right, to use like the Greek term, what happens is not only are people being paid less, but in order to make that subsistence living, what happens is, there's kind of this stupid, idea of the man as a breadwinner, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he's taking care of his family. And what Marx observes is in this system, this is the start of this happening. He can no longer be a breadwinner. He can no longer make enough money to provide for his family. So, obviously the next step is you enlist your partner, your wife into this. So she all of a sudden becomes a wage laborer as well. But this gets extended so far that, you're enlisting your children also into the, whatever trade you might work for. And, he makes this observation that basically the income that the mother and father would typically bring in becomes dispersed over the entire family. Exactly. And he uses the term in the book as basically forcing parents to become slave masters of their own family, where they're basically selling their own, at times, 4, 5-year-old, 6-year-old children into labor in order to basically make the income that they were making previously, or make the equivalent, right?
And so he describes this interesting process, which he divides into virtual displacement and actual growth, right? How can these two things happen? How can a machine displace an enormous amount of laborers, i.e., say it took 500,000 laborers to create the entire cotton industry, right? Mm-hmm. But the actual cotton industry only requires 100,000 of them, or 50,000. These are arbitrary numbers, right? And therefore, if it was 100,000, 400,000 people are now virtually out of work. Workers that cannot have those jobs that once existed. But because of the tendency of growth and extension, the creation of new factories, the new class of people whose jobs it is to build machines and therefore spread this industry, you will have actual growth that are terrible jobs. Situations, he describes one where a family is living in basements, unventilated basements, working 14, 15, 16 hours a day.
And then often asked by their boss to bring their work home at like 10 p.m. to finish it
Yes.
at home, right? So it's like there's not even the end of the work bell doesn't even matter, right? Like,
and these are your children. You are bringing, not only is an adult a 15-year-old, but your children are being brought into situations, some of which are incredibly physically violent. But what he's also describing is the immense amount of exhaustion, the immense psychological toll that strips us of our humanity and then leaves us in a home that is destitute. And this is one of these, this is the revolutionary shift that the capitalist describes as an equivalent exploitation, the exploitation of the machine by the human because they get to do things so much more efficiently, and the actual exploitation of the human by the capitalists through the machine as they sap them of their life force,
their vitality,
of their
vitality. So here's the quote that I was referring to. Our first assumption was that the capitalist and the worker, we remember this from the first chapter, the capitalist and the worker confronted each other as free persons, as independent owners of commodities, the one possessing money and the means of production, the other labor power. But now the capitalist buys children and young persons. Previously, the worker sold his own labor power, which he disposed of as a free agent, formally speaking. Now he sells his wife and child. He has become a slave dealer. Notices of demand for children's labor often resemble in form the inquiries for Negro slaves that were formerly to be read among the advertisements in American journals. And he goes on and gives some example from an English inspector who alludes to this similarity. And so what you have here, right, like as you're saying, is this deal where the worker and their family are becoming more and more desperate as machinery comes in, lessens the amount of jobs. And now the capitalists would say that, we are just, we are making them free. They would say they don't have to work, but of course they do have to work because this whole system is based on the exchange of time, of labor time, for a subsistence rather than I make a product, I sell it, I reap the rewards.
And this was really stunning to me, but it was also so typical of the mental gymnastics that capital uses to, couch its petty violences against human beings. That somehow by making things more efficient, we're setting you free of that job, that boring old, rural job that you had and that your father had and that, and that fed your whole family, and we're giving you ultimately in trade new, cheaper commodities. When in fact, they know as well as anyone else that they're just sending people to a job market where they're likely to work at a factory that replaced their job and that brutalizes them.
Yeah, and there is they would make this argument where, you lost your job here, but now there's jobs at the factory that makes the machines that runs our factory. But what really winds up happening is this ever decreasing return for the worker, where your chances or your opportunities are always slighter. There's always less jobs available. They always pay less and are less meaningful. I think this is something that's always missed in Marx, that it's not just that you're being exploited more or being paid less or something like this, but the redundancy and monotony of the work that you are now being employed to do saps you of the kind of human spirit
Mm-hmm.
that predominates the development of the machines in the first place. And and so it's just placing you at just such an extreme pressure, where of course exploitation is rampant because everyone is desperate for whatever meager subsistence that they could find.
And what happens out of this, and you were talking about this earlier before the episode started, is that there are phases to this, and we got to this a little bit in talking about how the industry develops into a fully formed, powered by the steam engine, and controlling a majority of space, of actual space. He describes the labor as intensive, right?
Mm-hmm.
It gets
Mm-hmm.
harder, and in this regard, it's calling back to a concept that we got into with Kant, which is that it is the industry is extensive in that it covers an enormous amount of space and controls an enormous amount of space, and is intensive in that it uses the time of the laborer to do more work, more painful work, and for less value. And in some regards, as I've been reading this, I've gotten the sense that value is the way, as it's famously said, Marx flips Hegel upon his head, right? He turns him upside down. That value is, in some ways, the correlate of spirit, right? That
Yes,
that
yes.
that spirit, in its sort of metaphysical generality and universality, right, is replaced by what is the actual social determinant at a time as it is historically determined. And that, in this case, is value.
Well, it's
Right?
interesting too because, like, right, like, it's such an interesting concept, right? Because, like, the capitalist, through having money, right, through having capital, is able to essentially do away with their need to expend their own labor,
Mm-hmm.
right? They are the overseer, whatever, however you want to term that. Um, but the, like, spiritual exchange in that is that because they are actually not producing anything, they do have to substitute value for spirit because they are essentially in this exchange selling their spirit for more money.
Yes.
And this is, I mean, this isn't explicit in this chapter of Marx, but, like, this is what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, you are, you know, in every trade there's an exchange, and in order to sit on your ass and fucking count money, what is it that you are giving up for that
Your
privilege?
valorized spirit.
Yeah, your sense of meaning of being able to create something and produce something and be proud of something, right?
And
Like,
be the boss and to dictate, and this is one of the elements that Marx does get into explicitly, is that relationships change under this new revolutionary mode of production, and they are old while the technological form is new and revolutionary and is producing things more efficiently,
mm-hmm.
quicker, more powerfully. The hierarchical system, where a person has a little group of people under them, or a family, literally a person is working with their kids at some machine, is something that is ossified and brought from past systems of value and past systems of production. And so there is this antagonism internal to it, and we'll get into this later when we talk about his comments on families, but there's this antagonism between the way in which people relate within this industrial system, even at the level of internal to one factory, from the boss to the overseers to the people who have to do the lowest jobs, and how that could function within a system of guilds, but cannot function anymore,
Right.
except as a violence against people.
As a violence. And I think to talk about that violence, like, and one of the revolutionary things about Marx is that he always keeps the human centered in this process. And this is really important, actually. And I think something that even modern economists don't understand. And because, okay, so we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, basically, where you're going from small advancements in technology that make something a little easier to bigger advancements until all of a sudden, it's not one woman taking three other people's jobs running a machine that runs 4 looms. She's actually keeping the machine running that runs 12 looms, that nobody runs because it's all been automated. But what Marx points out with this, so when the capitalist goes through this transition where their small manufacturing company becomes a factory and then becomes a efficient, fully automated factory, is early on in that trade they're making huge profits. So like if they're the first ones to get the machine that controls 12 looms, they are making money hand over fist because they are producing commodities at such a lower cost than their competitors are. They are literally stacking bills, Scrooge McDuck style. But what happens, of course, right, is that the industry catches up.
Yeah, there's a normalization of the market because the technology, and this is an interesting element. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
But as Marx says about the natural sciences, like these things are available to everyone. There is an indifference to the information of a chemical formula or technology. Maybe it can be held for some small time, but eventually people are going to figure it out, and this has a natural normalizing and somewhat destructive process.
Right, as Marx says at the beginning of the book, commodities cost the socially mediated time it takes to make them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when the rest of the industry catches up to, the first guy with the crazy machine that runs 11 looms or 12 looms or whatever it is, those gross extreme profits that the capitalists experience at the very boom normalizes.
Mm-hmm.
They don't become crazy profits anymore because everyone is using the machine, and the cost of these commodities that you're making decrease because it's the social mediated time.
Absolutely.
And I think Marx is really smart when he notices this. But he says, and he's referring to this boom time at the very beginning when technology first touches his tongue. The magnitude of the profit gives him an insatiable hunger for yet more profit. But there's a problem, right? Socially, we've mediated that all this stuff costs less now. So how is he going to keep making this crazy profit? Well, it comes back to labor time.
Mm-hmm.
And this, what does he say? The insatiable hunger drives this capitalist to the only way he can make more money is through his variable capital, which is humans, which is workers, which only drives him to exploit his workforce more and more, which is why you get into this, you'll read about this in when you read about the Industrial Revolution, where you have, people working from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or, there's examples in this book of children even working from 4 a.m. to 9 p.m. and then bringing home more lace work to work on at home. Because, and I think this is where Marx is the most revolutionary, this is the only way to increase your profits, which what the capitalist must do is the only way to do it is to exploit labor. It's the only piece of the process that is variable. Once you make a machine, it's constant profit, and you're taking, say you employ people and that costs $3,000, but then you get a machine and that costs, $1,500. So, okay, you still have $1,500 to pay workers. So, whatever, you cut your workforce in half. But in order to make up the money you spent on that machine, you need to exploit these workers more.
And it creates in the relation to that variable capital, that variable labor, it creates an absolute formula. The machine is exactly the labor it costs to build the machine. And therefore, any time that the capitalist sees the opportunity to replace a part of the workforce, a part of labor, with its equivalent value in a machine,
Yeah.
they will do so. And what this does is it makes the capitalist try to skirt around the edges and not simply reduce how much you're paying someone, but they'll they'll create a holiday where they don't have to pay people. And I forget exactly what the example that he does, but he brings up that, you have $1,500 of labor, and you do not want to spend it on these people's labor, so you create a forced holiday where the people go out and you save that money, right, until you ostensibly can spend it on something
and he
else.
brings up this thing where, pre-industrialization, he uses the textile industry in England as an example, but from like the early 1800s through, I can't remember the date, but like we'll say 1850, things are relatively stable. There are some, a few years of downturn and market crashes, but as soon as you get the industrialization and of the factory, just like what we experience today, there's a financial crisis every 5 years, or less in those days. And so in Marx's words, I'm going to give you the confusing Marx and then the to the point Marx. He says, the economic paradox that the most powerful instrument, machines, the factory, for reducing labor time, which is the big expenditure that capitalists have, suffers a dialectical inversion and becomes the most unfailing means for turning the whole lifetime of the worker and his family into labor time at capital's disposal for its own valorization. Or as he says a page later, machinery is the surest means of lengthening the working day.
Yes.
There it is,
And this comes to another element of this chapter, which I didn't remember, but there is a new antagonism that is created, and one that he finds necessary. It is a social reaction, which is factory acts and the attempt to reform the actions of the capitalist and the effects of machinery on labor.
So this is like specifically in capital, typically the English government, reforming industry to say make sure that if kids work in a factory, they have to be in school a certain amount of hours.
Yes, or they have to be of a certain age, which we got into an episode or two ago. Or that there were limits on women's working time, because at the time there was an expectation of management of the family and so on. Like there are many of these rules, but as you mentioned with the example of education, like there were extreme measures taken by the capitalists to make absolutely sure that nobody would learn anything, that they did not have to expend anything on the time that was used for education of children. He talks about during he says the spirit of capitalist production emerges clearly from the ludicrous way the so-called education clauses of the factory acts have been drawn up. from the absence of any administrative machinery, whereby this compulsory education is once again made for the most part illusory, from the opposition of the manufacturers themselves to the education clauses, and from the tricks and dodges they use to evade them. And this would include people who could not read themselves,
Right.
being the teachers.
Being the teacher, yeah. Where because they had to sign these documents, as sort of a administrative assurance that they were teaching the classes, but they couldn't sign the documents because they couldn't read. So it was just, there's a preponderance of teachers signing that, yes, I taught class with X's, with crosses.
Yes.
Because they couldn't sign their own names because they couldn't read.
And so, you have this very interesting process whereby the factory acts are necessary, but as Marx points out, they will necessarily push down the small factory, which is going to get hit the hardest by any type of mediation by the state, and therefore lead to further normalization. But
of the factory lifestyle, of the lengthening of the working days, of the exploitation of workers. Yeah.
But at the same time, it is the only means by which the state and the people who have elected these people, or sometimes unelected, can resolve some of these problems, can send someone into a factory to check. And when they do so, the capitalist cries foul and tries to come up with any excuse as to how this is both obstructing them and obstructing their production, which is good for the state,
Yet, and time again, he gives examples where these acts are enacted. Sounds ludicrous, but there you go. So, these reforms are enacted, and then immediately in 8 months, 16 months, the capitalist is like, oh yeah, that's actually fine. We got it. And usually this is through the intensification of work. So if it's a limit, say, of how long children can work, the capitalist response is speeding up the machine.
Yes.
So they actually get more work done in less time, but they have to work harder and faster. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because this is one of the big points about, I think, technology in general, but industry specifically, is that it is this contradictory, this, you might say, dialectical instrument where, the liberal attempts to improve conditions, to make things better, only serve the capitalists and actually only make things worse in this very strange way. And I think, this is the Industrial Revolution.
Because that's the technical side of the revolution. Exactly. The technical side is, and this was later articulated by Marxians, but is already completely spelled out in here, is that capital has the ability to constantly recognize that which challenges it, which endangers it, and to consume those elements and transform them into something that is positive and productive for capital. But it does so at the cost of people. And this is not to say, and why I believe that Marx understands the necessity of this as a reaction, a subjective, a collective and subjective reaction by the public, is that, it's undoubted that these factory acts, which he thinks need to be universalized for all facets of work, they do change conditions of labor. But as we've seen, while, we cannot say here that, a vast majority of people are dealing with children working, though we do have that, or
and it's being brought back.
It's being brought back, or terrible conditions, though there are terrible conditions, and in some ways the physical has moved more and more to the psychological, but they have simply shifted that whereas the antagonisms were male versus male, female, and child, now it may be domestic versus foreign worker, right?
Right,
Or
right.
before it was handicraft versus industrial machinery. It now is a industrial process with human hands to a purely robotic process, or human oversight versus computerized virtual oversight, right? These different elements consistently and completely outflank the ability for a factory law or any type of law that is trying to control capital to ever fully do the job.
Well, and look what happens, right? It's like these laws get enacted, and it's not always because of these laws. Some of it's just the law of capital accumulation, right? But okay, so we've determined that with the introduction of machines, you're reducing your workforce, and contradictorily, the reduction of workforce means you have less workers to exploit, which means you need to exploit the workers you do have even more to maintain your rate of profit, right? This is kind of the thesis of this chapter, is that while what first seems like a great boon for the capitalist in that we've made our workers more productive so less workers can make more goods for cheaper, at the end of the day, you're actually presented with less workers to exploit. So in order to keep your rate of profit high, you need to exploit the few workers you still have more, which is if you're connecting the dots, the obvious reason behind colonialism, where it's like, well, we are working these poor slobs, 14, 15 hours a day. We're running the machines as fast as they'll go before they break. There's tables in this chapter of the rates of death in certain industries, which are for certain age groups in certain industries, 1 in 8 per year.
An incredible example about Ireland and
Yes.
A device, I believe it was for some agricultural function, but because they didn't want to spend a little bit of money on the training or the devices, the other machines that would provide safety and wouldn't ultimately provide profit, they were ripping people in half.
Truly, literally.
Daily.
Yeah.
But
so obviously it's like, well, okay, we're exploiting these people as much as we can. There's, we're really reaching the limits of our exploitation. Well, what do?
You go find a new pool.
You go somewhere that isn't England, where the value of your currency is worth more in this area, and you pay these workers even less than you have to pay the slobs at home.
And there's also the other side, which is that with this new machinery, you have this insatiable appetite for raw material.
Mm-hmm.
And these places suddenly become a space for the extraction of raw material to reproduce machinery at home, to produce machinery there that will produce for home. And this is what creates a flattening effect across all geographical areas that allows for the development of a market of this concept. The capitalists now will often say, well, there are markets, right? These markets are separate, they're unique, they different behaviors, etc. But there is a condition that ties them all, which is that ultimately they're using the same mechanisms to drive profit. They're using the same mechanisms to organize people, and their products are moving in between each other. They're moving from one country to another, from one continent to another. And
you're seeking further normalization, again, of this technology, of, the normalization of the exploitation of the proletariat. And this chapter is he doesn't. I don't even know if he uses the word proletariat. He certainly uses the word peasant in this chapter. But that is what this is doing. It is the creation of the proletariat, where there are no longer peasants who provide for themselves. Everyone is selling their labor time, and he talks about this sort of at the end of the chapter with mining industries and urban agriculture, mass ag, in that everyone is moving from the rural centers to the urban centers. You are implementing the same technologies in your agriculture, which is both having a similar effect on the people who are still in rural areas, making agriculture possible, but also destroying your land. Because you're using intensive farming practices that don't allow plots to stay fallow and regenerate their nutrient base. So of course, why wouldn't you want to ship that overseas? Why? Because then you have more people for your factories, and you're not ruining your land that is now becoming not agricultural land, but vacation land.
Yes.
Or estates, I guess would be the word for the English, right? And this is the creation of that. This is that, and this is why he continually refers to it as a revolution, like countless times in these chapters. He calls it a revolution because, and I'd love to hear your take on this, because I think in a funny way what Marx is doing, and he's not saying this explicitly, this is my take, so don't fucking at me, don't at Marx or something. But
Marx's ghost is like, you fucking idiot.
But he's giving us the bedrock for what a revolution is, because the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't a revolution in industry or in production. It was a revolution in, of course, those things, but in what families are, what family life is, what your food expectations are, what your expectations of the government is, how you your expectations for how often you sleep, when you sleep, for what your home looks like, what your home life looks like. And that, in order to have an additional revolution against a capitalist process, it can't just be cutting off some king's head, some czar's heads. You actually have to revolutionize the entire system.
Well, when we have bourgeois revolutions and the king's heads were cut off, and power was no longer consolidated in castles and
right,
in little towns that were able to exert through family ties power over an entire country. Yes, a bunch of people getting together and with pitchforks could take down a system. But the system that he's describing now, and one of the most interesting things ways he describes the machine, is as autocratic, right?
Yes.
There is a new system where the enemy has changed, right? The capitalist is mediated by these machines that have this autocratic control over behavior. They take away skill, they take away thought, they take away energy, and they transform all of these relations, and there's unintended consequences. The woman being brought into the workforce in some ways will eventually empower women. Probably not at this point, maybe to some extent, but largely or far offset by the violence done against them. But it does, and he says it explicitly, it creates a new form of relation through cooperation. And that new form of cooperation, if thought about intentionally, if recognizing the inherently political element of these factories, not only in how they change your life everywhere, but in that the first way that we react to them is through the political process and through law, but that that doesn't have the power to fully transform things in the way that these new revolutionary and simultaneously autocratic
Yes.
machines do.
Yeah, and he does talk about like this idea that the consolidation of workers in the city, for instance, you know, gives workers power. Being together, being consolidated gives you power. But he also talks about the unions. Uh, but he does talk about how the same system fractures that power by employing the entire family. So no one has any spare time, because let's be frank, like the biggest thing you need to revolt is time, right? I mean, because that is the thing you're selling, right? Ostensibly, that is they're exploiting you for your time. They're not paying you for all of your time. That's how profit accumulation works in a capitalist system. You've agreed to trade X amount of your time for a subsistence living, but they're milking that time, and they're not actually paying for what you're producing. They're paying for a fraction of it, and
They turn the human being and the family and these institutions that were once like very central to meaning into an aggregate, into a body,
yes,
into the body of the machine. The machine has its appendages, its tools, but those are connected to people who are connected to another machine that are connected to more people, right? And these people are going home to a slum, and that slum is not providing the communal value that was once provided in a small town where people
right,
actually knew each other, right? Like, I don't mean to sound prelapsarian as if, oh, it was so great back in
right,
feudal times. I'm not
sure,
Peter Thiel, but at the same time, like what he's recognizing, and he points this out when like the Luddites, the actual Luddites, went and destroyed a bunch of factory equipment, which then brought down the violent hand of the state and the capitalists even harder on people, right? Like, you can't put it back in the box, so you have to begin to imagine a new form of living
yeah.
that will use this system.
And true revolution is more of thwarting the expectations of who these machines are serving and to what end. Because like right now we're always stuck in this loop, right, where we want to overthrow the government or industry or whatever so we can live lives that more resemble theirs.
Yes.
But that is not revolution. That is actually just
Retrenchment.
retrenchment. Yeah, that's part of the system we're living in, right? And how do we escape that? It will take another revolution, but one that is hard to fathom sometimes.
And I think similarly, there is a part in here where he talks about like the codes, the bureaucratic codes that the business owner, that the capitalist uses to control the lives of people, and how the state begins to mimic that, right? And here he says, the code is merely the capitalist caricature of the social regulation of the labor process, which becomes necessary in cooperation on a large scale and in the employment in common of instruments of labor and especially of machinery, right? So machinery necessitates a system of rules and a system of codes, of understanding, of communication, to help cooperation. But it caricatures that, just as I think many of the bureaucracies of state caricature that. And that is not revolutionary. That has no revolutionary potential. What it does is to actually get to the heart of these new machinic rules. And I'm getting a bit delusing here, but I can't help
Yeah,
it.
let's go.
But to form a new body that where the individual and humans can match the fluidity and dynamism that the technological development is already producing. How do humans become as subjectively revolutionary as technology is materially revolutionary.
Right. And like and this goes back to, his idea that, all of this is fundamentally based on the relationship between the machine and the worker, right? Uh, what does he say? The self valorization of capital by means of the machine is related directly to the number of workers whose conditions of existence have been destroyed by it. And so, whatever path towards revolution has to be based on this relationship, on repairing that relationship. And, I hate slipping into this, but it feels kind of Soviet, right? Because the Soviets were by no means were afraid of the industrialization of their society as a means to achieving revolution. They weren't, again, like they weren't Peter Thiel. They weren't trying to return to some past that doesn't exist. They were in fact living in that past. But they understood that relationship was important, and through some dialectical outcome, perhaps there is a way forward in reassessing that relationship.
Yeah, and if we look at some of the follies and the successes of the Leninist period of the Soviet era, on the one hand, the Soviet era was a time of extreme social and political creativity, right? You had groups of people working together to create out of whole cloth an entirely new bureaucracy, an entirely new system of labor, an entirely new way of speaking, a way of thinking that, allowed for a country to strip itself of its bondage. But one thing that was true about Lenin was that he was fundamentally skeptical of the Soviets, the actual Soviets.
Right, yeah.
As in, a Soviet would be a group of regional workers that were organized.
An autonomous group that had agency to make decisions for their town, right?
Yeah, and they would get together and have a say in the larger framework of the state. So, what Lenin created was the Politburo, which at the time was a machine, a virtual machine of people who could have a control over the various groups of laborers in Russia, but also to keep an eye on all the different movements around the world. And within the hands of Lenin, this wasn't so dangerous. Obviously, if we were to get into the historical nitty gritty, we could definitely find some times where
of course
it got authoritarian.
Yeah.
But when Stalin was able to effectively create a counter-revolution and take control, the Politburo became a weapon of control and of determining the future of what was the most vibrant and vital leftist movement in the history of the world.
Well, he used this virtual machine of the Politburo like a capitalist uses the machines he buys in his factory, mm-hmm. right? And obviously it had the same outcome. It churned through people. But that's a very interesting point, and I think something that deserves a lot of our thought, which is, we live in a world of, I think the idea of a virtual machine now is a lot different than sort of the concept you're conjuring, but, we live in that world where perhaps there is a virtual machine. But again, this is the question: how do we escape the system we are living in, which is to use a machine? Like, machines are, you increase their productivity to increase the productivity of their exploitation of the folks that run them.
Mm-hmm.
And how does a machine, how do you reverse engineer a machine to do the opposite? I don't know.
Well, I think back to our episode where we covered all of the like Bitcoin
Oh
and
Jesus,
like
yeah.
all that,
In the glory days.
GameStop stuff,
Yeah.
and you know, just as like when we're dealing with Web 1.0, you feel like you're in a new frontier, and then slowly or very quickly, in fact, you see it codify, and a bunch of websites decide they're going to do banks, but online,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You have PayPal, for instance, which produced many of the like peak douchebags of our current society, Teal and Musk being the first to come off the top of my head. But you know, in these moments, we look at the technology, we see this potential, but we're not imagining that potential in a way that is truly revolutionary. Like
Right.
we speculated, is there
Right.
revolutionary potential for Bitcoin? But obviously, the technology is already being determined by capital. It's already been organized and formed in a way where it is going down a path in which it will create further exploitation, be it exploitation of energy, be it exploitation of people who are scammed, be it its eventual conversion into a new universal banking system
Mm-hmm.
that further normalizes
Well, look
money.
at social media right now. Like everything is a scam.
Yes.
Every advertisement you get, every damn direct message you get from somebody, it's all, we live in the age of scams,
And this
which
social media was supposed to be this connective tissue that would allow us real, authentic, and worldwide communication. But no, it isn't that. One, people will be censored left and right. Two, that which we have access to is so socially mediated by the preconceptions of capital, by the tendencies and institutions of capital, that there is no meaningful freedom. But if we look at technology before it's even produced, or if the producers of the technology are thinking about it in a way where it's to be
mm,
socialized, then it would have some potential. But this would require more than just that person thinking that way or a group of people thinking that way. It would require a party. It would
what,
require
dude? What's that Benjamin essay? The artist as not activist. The artist is producer. I think it is. But that's like what you're talking about, right?
yeah.
It's like it's being cognizant of creation, because this is really what Marx is talking about here,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is that these machines are being designed to their specifications
Yes.
to do a certain task, and obviously it's when you have a specific task in mind, it's pretty easy. Like once upon a time when my grandfather was still alive, his tool and die maker, he made the machine that designed the machine that made Baker's square pie tins. That's his claim to fame, right? Not that he's famous or
That's
has a
awesome.
claim to it, but it's easy when you're given a charge, right?
Yeah.
But this is, and I'm sure we'll talk about Benjamin in episodes to come, but this is the idea you're bringing up, that as producers, as creators, we must be producers and we must be cognizant of what we're creating, because the capitalist world that we live in, what does it create? It creates, capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil.
Mm.
Capitalist production, therefore, only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social processes of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil, and the worker. And so it's about that cognizance, and it's about creating machines that do not rob, that give, right? Like
Exactly. And you see certain elements that are just like through lines for this chapter. Um, how is it that we will organize as people that is equal to and revolutionary in relation to present society, right? Because the way we think of a family unit still in this concept of the nuclear family is one of those like past ossifications
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
pressed onto society that limit us. The way that we associate with the land, the way that we treat the environment. And I think there's a lot of issues with the way that ecologists imagine, an environmental revolution and the realities of how humans function with technology, and how technology is not something that human society controls. There's an alienation there. And right,
Yes.
and there has to be an overcoming of that alienation, as well as an acceptance of that alienation being a part of us, being a part of our consciousness. Maybe there might be a time without alienation, but I can't imagine it. And also, just how do we form a city? How do we create laws? How do we organize work? And this is what we've been going on throughout the whole book, of course. How do we organize the proletariat so that the distinctions and the obstructions and the ways in which there's a really great passage in here where Marx describes new production now. He describes the industry and the factory as a riddle, and it is a riddle that not only the person on the outside can't figure out, but now the person on the inside of the factory can't figure out this riddle, right? And I think layers upon that have been created as things have become more virtual, more algorithmic. There's even less understanding of what is right in front of us, these processes of production. So how do we decode these riddles? And so these all form elements of a person, of a group of people necessarily, that can be revolutionary.
Well, and we forget, these systems become reified, and we forget that they're a riddle. We forget that they're a problem to be solved. And I think if there's any hope, is that people love solving problems, right? I mean, look at video games, right? People love solving problems, and so maybe that's the first step, right? Is the reintroduction of the riddle, and
Deleuze has this great section in Difference and Repetition where he says, stupidity is necessary to thought. We come out of stupidity. It is the grounds of thought. It is the place where thought meets the ground. And but it's
the
also
fertile soil,
yeah,
right? Like,
but it's also the place where the despot is, or where the autocrat is, right? It's the place where people are pulled back in. But at the same time, stupidity also leads to the problem. It leads to the problematic. It leads to the recognition that knowledge does not relate to facts in this very basic and positivist way, but it instead relates to truth. He never says truth, but it relates to reality as this continuous unfolding problem, right? And that to gain that problematic relationship and to fully understand it is to realize a freedom, realize a sort of freedom. And, throughout this section, I saw so many elements of what would become Anti-Oedipus and A Thousand Plateaus. We'll get into that a long time down the line, because I will die on the hill that nobody really gets into how Marxian Deleuze is, but whatever. But
we will.
But we will. We'll do that. I've been doing it for 20 years, man.
But this is the fertile ground that this thought springs, and as much as he talks about the revolution of the Industrial Revolution and how revolutionary it really was, we're still, I think, seeing the seeds and the sprouts of Marx and of this book propagate, because that's what he's doing here, and that's why it's so important for us to talk about, because he's not we did fucking Communist Manifesto, right? And it's compared to this, it's a stupid fucking book. It's a pamphlet.
Yeah.
And there's really not a lot of meat to that meal, but there is to this. And this isn't even a political piece.
Yeah.
It's not a philosophical tract, although the philosophical ground that he's talking about is so fertile. It's just a book on economics that even economicists today still haven't understood, and this is why we see the same problems repeated ad infinitum.
Yeah. If you are working at an Amazon factory or a Starbucks, if you are bored out of your mind in your office and you feel as if your soul is being sucked out of you, if you are, in a shitty town in the South where manufacturing has disappeared and now the people who are left work at a prison or run some shitty little shop that, can't afford them anything, and they're on the internet all the time.
Service of retail, baby. Service of retail.
All of us, if you're selling dope on a corner, and that is your means of survival, you and that person working at their fucking car shop in Paris, Texas, right, are the same. Right? There is a continuity that has to be organized, right? Because that is the connection, right? That's one of the connections. There's many other connections that need to be created, divisions that need to be overcome, so that we can form something, a labor party that will allow us to create something new, to create something creative, to create something with the potential to stand up to the entrenched, reified values of a long dead industrial monstrosity.
Applaud this man, people. Applaud this man.
I'm not a crook.
I am not a crook. Thank you guys for tuning in. I think that's really the meat and the bones of it. But yeah, thank you for joining us on this journey. Like, hopefully you're getting the sustenance out of this book that we are. It is truly, I mean, Marx was a really brilliant guy, as poor and as much of a dog as he was.
It's a masterwork.
It is. So thank you. We've got one big, important section coming up next, and that'll probably conclude Capital for us. So watch out for that.
We're also going to try to do some cool Marxian essays so that, you see a little bit of the development, and
we don't want to lose the philosophy. Yeah. This is an economic tract after all. But thank you for joining us. And
Patreon, Instagram, Facebook, and of course YouTube.
Yeah, you can also just mail us money too. Just DM one of us, and we'll take any unmarked bills you might have lying around. So
Swiss francs, is it?
Yeah, Swiss. But until next time,
have a good one, guys.